In previous episodes, I've already taken a bunch of the cool, hostile Minecraft mobs that would make good supervillains and, turned some of them into superheroes instead. But luckily Minecraft is chock full of cool hostile mobs, and there's plenty that I haven't worked with. So even though the last episode of Minecraft Superheroes was a while ago, I went back through that comment section and took a whole bunch of good ideas for what mobs would specifically make good supervillains. And that is what we're getting into today. Let's go! Hit like if you want, subscribe if you feel like, but either way, enjoy the show. In the last decade, Craftopolis has become a massive hub for hero and villain activity. Many villains were initially attracted to the wealthy city due to its abundance of bleeding-edge technology innovations companies that had plenty of unique inventions primed for the stealing. It seems every day new empowered beings are popping up to throw their hats into the ring of the near-constant hero versus villain conflicts. And some haven't had an easy time keeping up with the added competition. Creed Percival used to be seen as one of the premier villains of this city. He'd never enacted any major crimes, but was consistent and could usually hold his own in a fight. He'd never been interested in taking over the city or killing swaths of people. When he'd started, he simply needed the money, and had power well suited to criminal activity. He can cause explosions within an inch of his body, ranging in power and severity. His body is durable enough to withstand serious damage from the blasts, but the flames could still burn his skin quite badly, and he'd originally come to Craftopolis to acquire a suit that could both protect him and channel his blasts into more targeted blows. A scientist/sorcerer for the local nefarious nether cult provided him with such a suit on the condition that he protect the cult for a few months, while they worked on some experiments to grant some of their own members super abilities. He hadn't planned on staying in Craftopolis after that, but quickly found his early brawls with local heroes were getting him some significant publicity. Not to mention that, as all other villains in the city had found, there was always plenty of wealthy fat cats around to rob in Craftopolis. So, he stayed, dubbed Explodus by the media, which he'd always thought to be a dumb name but never cared enough to try and make them change it. In his early years, he was a well-known and feared villain. But as time passed, with more and more heroes popping up, he eventually found his powers couldn't keep up. His greatest embarrassment came when he had a robbery thwarted by a hero whose powers barely gave her any combat potential, Layla. She was a young newcomer that had originally been a laughingstock of the villain community, as her powers were essentially just to fly around and find things. And even still, she utilized her flight well enough to just about get Creed arrested. He barely escaped and knew he'd be a laughingstock among other villains, so for a short while, he fled the city. He thought he may just need a change of pace, another city in which to enact his crimes where the heroes weren't as well versed in his powers. He attempted a robbery in Emerald Central, but quickly found the heroes there were even more formidable. A blue super speedster quickly showed up and was quite literally running circles around him. But something interesting happened when the hero ran in to lay what could have been a finishing blow. The lightning that emanated from this hero as he ran all absorbed directly into Creed as he was struck, and it was like his body then became supercharged. The punch still hurt and seriously dazed Creed, but after it, he let out an explosion nearly 10 times the size of anything he'd done before and blasted the unsuspecting hero away from him. He slammed through the concrete wall of a building and was knocked out cold. The sparking energy that had fueled that blow did soon fade, but Creed got away with his crime, and more importantly had discovered a new ability. One that may be enough to put him back on top of the villain game in Craftopolis. If Creed was to return to his city, he was going to do it right. He took some time to test out his new power enhancement, doing some favors for the Nether Cult again to get his suit upgraded to be able to shock him and give him a few extra charges of explosive power. But he worried even that wasn't enough. He needed to take some time to learn how other villains in the city were managing to hold their own against the massive ranks of heroes now running around.
The first he looked to was Eldengaard, who led a whole gang of minions in criminal activity, generally focused on any places or people that could be robbed along the shores or in the waters of the Craftopolis Bay, as the group all had tech that gave them aquatic-based abilities. Eldengaard was a fairly secretive villain, but it was heavily rumored that prior to acquiring his minions, he'd enacted many crimes in international waters, robbing cruise liners and whatnot, until some very powerful heroes thwarted him one too many times and pushed him inland. Once in Craftopolis, he started building his band of followers. Elden and his guardlings all wore suits that gave them the ability to breathe underwater, gave them mechanical tails, both for propulsion and striking opponents with, gave them a series of spikes along their body, including ones that could spring from their forearms to impale foes, and finally, they could fire powerful beams of energy from the single lenses on their helmets. So far as Creed could tell, nobody had ever actually seen Eldengaard's face. Many of his minions had been captured in the past, but no hero had ever managed to apprehend him. There were even some rumors floating around that he himself was actually some kind of automaton built by another villain in the city to enact crimes for them, but this had never actually been proven. It seemed one of the main ways Eldengaard was managing to stay on top of his game was by simply having his minions do much of his work for him, which wasn't much help to Creed. He briefly entertained the idea of hiring goons himself, as he'd certainly stolen enough money in his time to afford them, but at the end of the day, he preferred working alone. Eldengaard's other main asset was that he could stay underwater for as long as he needed and rarely came up onto land. There were some formidable water-dwelling heroes in the city, but none whose power quite matched up to Eldengaard, who, on top of all the abilities granted by his suit, was a massively burly man with strength that well exceeded that of a normal human. Any hero with the potential to match his strength, such as Raid Ravage, was near useless in an underwater fight. Again, unfortunately, this wasn't any help to Creed, as his explosions were significantly hindered underwater as well. While Eldengaard was an impressive villain, there was little Creed could learn from the watery brute that could help him, so he turned his attention to another villain, one who'd had a resurgence in her career that was very similar to what Creed hoped to pull off. Chilomancer had only really made a name for herself as a villain not to be trifled with in the last few months, despite having appeared on the scene initially 2 years ago. She was a cryomancer able to summon and control ice, who'd gained her powers through a ritual with the Nether cult. She'd worked as one of their many superpowered protectors until she suffered an incredibly embarrassing defeat at the hands of one of the city's aquatic-based heroes, a newcomer to town who went by Glowcephala. Like Alayla, the hero who'd thwarted Creed, Glowcephala was seen as an overrated sidekick more so than a hero. She had little in the ways of powers, and when she was out of water, she was barely more than a regular human. This made it that much more embarrassing when Glowcephala defeated Chilomancer on land in a matter of seconds by literally tricking her into hitting herself in the head with a cluster of her own ice. The whole event had been televised and was blasted all over the news, and not only was Chilomancer arrested, but she became a laughingstock. She was imprisoned for almost a year, but all the while lurking in that dank dungeon, she was training. She ignored the embarrassment and focused on honing her powers. Little did anyone who'd locked her away know, when she sat still and focused enough, she could project herself into the Nether, the place from which the Nether cult had pulled her powers. It was a hot and foul place, not ideal for a cryomancer, but it was also full of monstrous creatures that she could train against. She spent that year projecting herself into the Nether every day, becoming more and more skilled with her powers, until finally she was ready for her comeback. She easily escaped prison and went right back to Craftopolis. She didn't even bother trying to get revenge on Glowcephala, as she thought it was beneath her now. Instead, she waited until a tougher hero made a public appearance. It wasn't long before Raid Ravage popped up to stop the robbery of a weapons manufacturing company smack in the middle of downtown. Chilomancer then appeared, donning a new outfit and with a swirling vortex of ice all around her. Raid Ravage tried all he could to apprehend her, but the longer the fight went on, the more bogged down with ice his mech suit became. Soon enough, he could barely move, and Chilomancer summoned a cocoon of ice all around him, raising him off the ground in it for all to see. The battle was televised across the city so all could get a good long look at the triumphant return of the once embarrassed Cryomancer. No villain thereafter would make fun of Chilomancer's once embarrassing defeat, and all heroes would know not to underestimate the might of this powerful villain. Chilomancer's story was inspiring to Creed, and he decided to simply keep training for some time with his new powers before making his return to the city spotlight. But just before getting down to work, he couldn't help but look more into a villain with an infamous reputation, even by villain standards. It was a twisted person he had no interest in learning anything from, but was curious about all the same. Little was known about Cara Banog's early life, but most imagined it couldn't have been pleasant, given how she turned out. While she currently resided in a supermax prison, many still feared her return, even some in the villain community. You see, there is an unwritten code amongst the villains of Craftopolis, and while it is more of a guideline than an actual set of rules, it's still fairly widely followed in criminal circles. Killing was only acceptable if necessary for the crimes being enacted, or if a villain has an opportunity to take an A-list hero out of the game for good. Cara Banog, previously known as Slayer Rabbit, far from followed this code. She wasn't interested in stealing tech or money or anything really. Her main and only goal seemed to be to kill. She would do so totally at random, popping up day or night somewhere in the city to kill whoever she so desired. She'd even been spotted in some cases with blood splattered around her lips, leading many to believe that she was eating parts of her victims, though many were so mangled after her attacks that it was hard to tell if parts were actually missing. She would have simply been considered a serial killer instead of an outright supervillain if it weren't for the fact that she did have incredible super speed and strength. She could take a hit better than almost any other villain in the city, so even when heroes did find her, they would never end up catching her, at least for a while. You see, many heroes had tried tracking her down to little success, as her appearances had no pattern, but eventually she pushed the city too far and forced a group of nearly a dozen heroes to team up to hunt her down. You see, a few years back, a young up-and-coming hero who was workshopping the name Hunger Lizard due to his reptilian skin and large jaw that could bite through steel, was only a couple weeks into his heroing career when Slayer Rabbit made him her next victim. He never even got the chance to show the city what he could do, as he was found in pieces. Not long after, the heroes of the city were finally driven enough to pool their resources and track her down. They found her a few days later in a blood-splattered cave under the city, and she put up quite a fight, wounding many of the heroes, and the tide of the battle only really turned when one of the fighters managed to hit her dead on with a grenade. But even that only weakened her initially. It was a long and difficult fight, but eventually they were able to take her out of the game for good. Or at least they hoped. Now, most villains and heroes alike are glad that she's rotting away in prison, but there is the ever-lingering fear that she may break out to once again wreak havoc on a city that still fears her name.
Oh yeah, I really like how this turned out. Of the 3 Minecraft superhero/villain episodes, I think this is definitely my favorite art-wise. I like how the other 2 turned out, I just think this one is the most consistently good. But of course, if you're new to the channel and you haven't seen those previous episodes, you might want to go back and check them out. Or just any of my superhero episodes. I'll link the playlist of my best ones. I've turned Subnautica Leviathans, Sonic characters, SCPs, just tons of different things into superheroes. And when we hit 500,000 subscribers, I'll be rebooting Pokemon as superheroes, one of the original series from this channel back before I did lore. It'll be a lot better when I reboot it. And of course, would love more ideas for if I continued this series or other things to do with Minecraft mobs or superheroes, just lots. I'm always pulling suggestions from the comments for what I do on here. But besides that, that's all for today, except of course for ending this video on some kind of positive or inspiring note. And the thought I want to leave people with today is one that I really like. I'm not sure who the quote is by, but it's that sometimes we don't get what we want, because we actually deserve better. I thought I wanted to be a self-published author a few years ago, and now that I'm running this channel full-time, I'm very glad that I did not get that, because I wouldn't have been driven to create all this. I hope that's helpful to someone out there. Thanks so much for watching, everybody. I love you all, and I'll see you all in the next episode on Monday. Goodbye.